I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the Ukrainian counterattack. Plus, one of the Telegraph's photographers on the front line, Simon Townsley, gives his response to those crying fake news to pictures of devastation in Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 28, and I'm joined by Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's defence and security editor. Welcome, Dominic. What are the latest updates from the front line?
It's been very quiet overnight, shelling in Kyiv and across the country into Kharkiv and down south into Mariupol, but generally no advances. The US Department of Defense put out a statement very recently. The SecDef is flying to a NATO meeting tomorrow in Brussels, so there's no formal briefing from the US DoD, Department of Defense, later today, but they have just put out a statement saying that there's been very, very little movement at all. Although they have said that both sides still have 90% of their combat power available to them. Of course, there's more than just numbers. It's what they can do with them. But no, not an awful lot of movement, which has allowed the Ukrainian forces to push back in a number of areas, number of small but significant areas that I think we're going to talk a little bit more about later on.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's start. So just on the front page of the Daily Telegraph today, our headline is Ukrainians regain key territory in fight back. Let's go through these different places. So starting with Makariv, a key town in the west of Kyiv. Can you talk a little bit about that? What happened there?
As we know, for the last few weeks, Russia has been pushing down from the north, and there was that 60-mile long convoy that just sort of sat to the north of Kyiv for quite some weeks, actually. What they're trying to do is they're coming down from the north from their bases in Belarus, and they're trying to get around the west and the east side of Kyiv down to the south to encircle the city, to then threaten it or bombard it or potentially try and take the city, although they've never got anything like the troop density to be able to do that. But sealing it off and then slowly starving it, as they have done with Mariupol, it seemed to be the kind of tactic they were after. So they've tried to push on both sides. We saw a couple of weeks ago that big attack from the east, from Brovary, where there was that column of about 30 tanks and armoured vehicles, including a thermobaric launcher that got hit by Ukrainian artillery and pushed them back there. So just in the last day, there's been significant fighting in Makariv, which is about 20 kilometres due west of Kyiv. So that has been retaken. The Ukrainian flag is now flying over the town once again, and it just means that flank assault round to try and get round to the salt has been repulsed for now. So this effort to try and encircle Kyiv is still nowhere near where it should be. I mean, they've really not advanced significantly in 3 weeks. So that's quite an important town that they took. It's got one of the main roads both into the capital and allowing further advance to the south. So to take that town was quite significant. And the Hostomel airfield that's featured for the last few weeks, that's a little bit further to the north. That is still there's still very heavy fighting around there, and it changes hands quite regularly. But this effort to push the Russians back from the northwest suburbs of Kyiv seems to be bearing fruit.
And there's also been some Ukrainian success and significant fighting in the city of Izium in the east. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so Izium, it's kind of halfway between Dnipro, which is on the Dnieper River, and the east of the country. So it's southeast of Kharkiv. It's just on the edge of the disputed territory, the kind of the Donbass area. So in the sort of Luhansk part of the Donbass, the town of Izium is just on the edge of that. And again, this is quite significant, because one of the aims that we think Russia are trying to do, if their main effort is in the south to try and get that land corridor from Crimea through to Russia, they also want to encircle Ukraine's forces in the Donbass, which, apart from those defending Kyiv itself, seem to be the better trained and the better equipped units of the Ukrainian forces. So if they're in the Donbass and Russia's able to cut them off, then again, it can just slowly wear them down. So to do that, they've obviously got the separatist republics themselves, and you've got the hard border of Russia, but they need to cut off that western flank. And Izium sat right in the middle of that. So to not be able to take that, and for Ukraine to still hold it, it then allows them to not only operate from there and push out, but enables them to resupply from the west of the country into that city. So again, quite a significant town. May only be a fairly small town itself, but it means a lot. It means that Russia are finding it incredibly difficult to encircle the Donbass, to squeeze and wear down the Ukrainian forces there.
And there's one more place I think we should talk about quickly before moving on to the tactics themselves. That's Mykolaiv, the city in between Kherson and Odessa, and there's been some Ukrainian success there as well.
Yeah, so south coast, you've got Crimea, and just the north of that you've got Mariupol, which is being bombarded. Just to the northwest, if you come from Crimea and you onto the mainland of Ukraine, just to the northwest is the city of Kherson, which was the first city to fall to Russia. Just west of that is Mykolaiv, which is contested, and so this is significant because it's west of the Dnieper River, and it's on the road to Odessa. So you've got to get through Mykolaiv if Russia wants to try and take the entire south of the country and that all-important port city of Odessa. So they could try and bypass Mykolaiv, but that then pushes them quite far north, and they leave themselves open to be hit in the sort of logistic columns that follow up towards the back, which the Ukrainians were showing themselves to be very adept at doing. So Mykolaiv needs to be taken basically if they want to move west into Odessa, and that again has seen some pushback from the Ukrainians, and they're gaining ground there. So again, it's the third significant sort of area of counterattack for Ukrainian forces.
Thanks very much, Dom. So just to say, if you're listening, thank you very much. If you've got questions about the Ukrainian counterattack or about the war, do reply to the tweet embedded in the space, or DM either Dom or myself. Dom, when we talk about the Ukrainian counterattack, what are their tactics and why are they successful?
Well, their tactics have been to not try and meet the point of Russian strength. So there's no point going toe to toe with a T-72. It's an old tank, but it's pretty potent. It can do a lot of damage. And of course, I mentioned the numbers earlier on. The US DoD, Department of Defense guy, saying that 90% of the combat power is still available. So you don't want to get into that numbers game. So what Ukraine have been very good at is almost having the courage and the confidence to allow that first, the tip of the spear, if you like, the hard armoured elements to go past them, and then to hit them from behind, to hit the logistic convoys, because these things obviously need fuel, they need ammunition, the people inside them need water and rations and all the rest of it. So if you attack that element of it, then the actual tanks themselves are very vulnerable. Plus, of course, Russia still hasn't gained air supremacy, and it's only able to enact air superiority, i.e. control small blobs of the air for limited amounts of time, very rarely. And they're mostly conducting their actions now at night because they are having such little success during the day. So these tactics of the Ukrainians to go for the logistic convoys, and then when the tanks have run out of fuel and are sitting there, as we've seen, these columns are just falling prey to these very, very mobile, very nimble, low-level infantry tactics. These wolf packs that are going around with the anti-tank weapons supplied by Western countries, and are picking off the tanks and the other armoured vehicles, because they are left vulnerable if they're not able to move and are not protected from the air. I mean, Russia are using a lot of artillery to pound cities and try and weaken the civilian resolve. That's one way of using artillery. The other way of using their fires is to do it in coordination with ground manoeuvre. And there is no point in trying to manoeuvre on the ground without having artillery fire and other fires as part of that effort. And equally, there's no point in just firing artillery into military areas if you're not going to try and exploit it from the ground. So not being able to link up those two arms just leaves the tanks and other the BMPs and what have you, the armoured personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, vulnerable to being picked off by the Ukrainian wolf packs.
So we've spoken about, I mean, you've mentioned this before on this podcast, about the lack of coordination between the different arms of the Russian military. It doesn't seem, from what you're saying, it doesn't seem like this has changed much through this war. Why do you think that is? What's going wrong?
Well, far be it for me to suggest it would all be better if only they'd listen to Dom. But I mean, we had a conversation on Twitter last December when I asked the question, who is the operational commander here? I said, if Russia are going to invade, then by December last year, when there were a huge number of forces built up on the border, they would have they should have picked an overall operational commander. There should have been one person, which in the Russian system is more than likely to be a man. So there'd be one bloke in overall command of the entire theatre who could command all assets: army, navy, air force, cyber, space, information, the whole panoply of military tools. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So the different military districts of Russia have supplied personnel and equipment for this fight, and they seem to be fighting their own wars. There seems to be a different war for the capital Kyiv, a different war in the east around Kharkiv and Chernihiv, different war in the Donbass, and a different war in the south. And they're not joined up. Ukraine is a vast country, so they are splitting resources. And when you have to overlay on top of that the requirement for an air force, for example, or satellite time and availability to provide you with intelligence as to where the Ukrainians are, then all these competing interests, it just dilutes the force. Now, if there'd been one overall commander who'd been able to veer and haul priorities as events on the ground change, and you need to adjust your plan. The famous military maxim, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." I mean, you've always got to change your plan. Even if you have a great idea, but it's never going to last for very long. But they don't seem to have been able to do that. They're just fighting these individual wars. The Air Force is not able to supply in any great numbers any of this, and it's all just a little bit diluted. So it's extraordinary. There either is no overall operational commander, or it needs to be sacked.
I think that goes into something else we've talked about before, but it'd be good to bring back again, about Russian kit. I mean, we saw a report on the Telegraph today that some Russian soldiers are reportedly suffering from frostbite. They're taking Ukrainian army-issued boots because their own the quality of their own isn't as good. Are we seeing more evidence then of the lack of preparation? And I know you wanted to talk a little bit about their sort of high-tech kit that we've been talking about.
Yes, we'll come on to the high-tech kit in just a moment. But these reports of frostbite and lack of tents and Russian soldiers taking Ukrainian boots and what have you. This came from a couple of sources. Firstly, it was an alleged intercepted phone call from Russian troops, soldiers to commanders. You've got to take that with a pinch of salt, of course. We don't know. We haven't had that verified. It does seem accurate with what else is being reported. And that was also repeated in last night's US Department of Defense briefing, saying that there were troop numbers were being depleted through basics such as frostbite. I mean, you would have thought of all the armies in the world, Russia should be aware of frostbite in fighting in cold conditions. But yeah, there we go. And this idea of taking Ukrainian combat boots. I mean, the British did that from the Argentines in the Falklands War. The British boots were pretty terrible back then, and they were taking boots off dead and wounded prisoners, Argentine prisoners. So there's a historical example of this. You can't. The clues are there. You can go and read the books and find out about these things. So it's amazing that it's happening again in 2022. But it does seem like a lack of morale and a lack of basic supplies, because the priority seems to be for Russia at the moment to get the artillery, get the shells, get the ammunition up front, get the artillery up there so they can continue their campaign of hitting civilian areas and just trying to wear down the Ukrainians from airborne fires. But that's prioritising artillery, and so what? They're not getting food, they're not getting water, they're not getting warm kit, they're not getting tents and all the rest of it. So they do seem to be in a fairly poor state. And of course, they're working on external lines of communication. So what that means is that they've got all their firm base back in Belarus and back in Russia proper, and they're having to send everything forward. Whereas Ukraine, of course, is working on internal lines of communication. So they've got all their stuff sort of close to hand and behind them. So if they have to withdraw, they are withdrawing back into an area of relative strength for material. They're falling back to their supply lines. So they are not overextending themselves. They can rely on the majority of the population to look after them, or to at least give them shelter, give them food, what have you. Russia can't do that. So Russia's really out on a limb here, and it seems to be having quite an effect on the fighting capability of the individual soldiers.
And I think, let's go on and talk about the high-level kit. I mean, there's been lots of stories of these sort of hypersonic missiles and so on, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the reality behind this.
This came over the weekend, basically. There were two stories. First of all, we heard that Russia had fired its Kherson, which means dagger, hypersonic missile. Sorry, I've got the name wrong. I've just said Kherson, that's the city. Apologies, got the name wrong. But the dagger hypersonic missile. Hypersonic missile is a missile that travels over Mach 5. So it can do two things. Firstly, it's just going so fast that it's got so much kinetic power that when it hits something, it does a huge amount of damage. And of course, it's full of explosive as well. But secondly, the thing about hypersonic missiles is that they can fly. So a normal ballistic missile goes up in the air, and then it's basically just physics. So you can work out where it's going to come down. You have your big radars that can see intercontinental ballistic missiles coming, re-entering Earth's atmosphere. You can work out where it's going to land, and therefore work out where it's been launched from. So it's different with hypersonic missiles, because if they can effectively glide or fly, they not only can conceal their approach, but also they don't just follow where physics is going to take them. So you don't know where they're launched from, and because the curvature of the Earth, you see them so late, you have very, very little time to react. So hypersonic missiles is the sort of the future, if you like, of the next generation of missile technology, and everyone's getting very energized about trying to develop these things. So I'm not taking away from the strike that happened on Saturday of an underground Ukrainian weapons storage site. It seemed to be an accurate hit, and it depleted that site. What I would just point out, though, is that missile is basically a modified Iskander short-range ballistic missile. So pretty capable, but it's not Star Wars, and it was launched. A lot of the heavy lifting, literally the heavy lifting, and getting it up to speed was done by the Russian Air Force plane that carried it and from which it was launched. So I just wanted to counter this idea that, oh my God, Russia's come out with this amazing new weapon. How can it be anything but complete defeat for Ukraine? I mean, we've got to be a little bit careful and look a little bit behind the headlines here. And then the second thing I'd point out is that Russia released some footage again over the weekend of them firing the thermobaric launcher, and again long range artillery fire, thermobaric weapons, pretty horrendous. I mean, use the oxygen in the air to make the explosive force a lot more powerful. It can blast buildings apart and cave complexes, and it's horrific for what it does to the human body. So it's terrible. We look at thermobaric weapons and we think this is absolutely horrendous, and they are. I'm not trying to diminish the potency of the weapon, but I just make the point, and I made this point in our daily dispatches newsletter. If you wish to, Telegraph does a daily newsletter. It's out at about 5 p.m. London time. Just a couple of thoughts from the war, and I made this point in yesterday's newsletter. So we see the thermobaric weapons, and we see the hypersonic missile. They're all long range, and Russia's showing us this long range stuff for a reason. And the reason is because they can't get in close range. They can't get close to firstly be more accurate with their weapons, or to provide any kind of close air support to their ground troops, because they're getting whacked. I mean, the Ukrainian Air Force is still fighting. soldiers on the ground have got anti-air weapons, and the Russian Air Force are very, very nervous about operating, certainly in daylight, but nervous about operating at all. And they're extremely nervous about getting close to the fight. So I just caution, when we see these amazing new missiles and thermobaric launchers and all the rest of it, just ask yourself why they're showing us all this stuff and why we're being told, look at this long-range missile and look at these long-range artillery. It's because they can't get in close. They can't get in the short range because of the effect the Ukrainian forces are having.
Thanks, Tom. Despite the good news for the Ukrainian armed forces, there are some signs things aren't going as well. Vadim Prystaiko told Sky News that the Ukrainian army are running out of weaponry. I wonder if you talk a little bit about some of the limitations they're finding.
Well, it does come back to that numbers game, and you're right. The Ukraine's ambassador here in London did say that they're running out of numbers. President Zelensky said they're going through a week's worth of kit in 20 hours. I mean, this is just simply unsustainable. We've talked at length in these poddies and spaces about the Western supply lines, the supply lines from the West through the neighbouring countries, and the effort of Russia to try and find these supply lines and stop them getting into the country. I mean, you should notice yesterday Poland expelled 45 Russian diplomats thought to be up to no good, and this is on the back of other diplomats that had been expelled last week, I think from Slovakia, and we were chatting about that. We wondered if these are the people who are out looking for these routes, trying to see where the kit's coming in from, and then letting their colleagues know in Western Ukraine that there's more stuff on the way for them to go and have a go at. So it is largely a numbers game. We've said before, this is a race between the West to get kit in there and Putin trying to so smash the civilian population that there's such pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership to try and stop the war, sue for peace. So it does come down to numbers. There's amazingly dogged resistance being put up by Ukrainian forces, but these missiles are they don't just appear, and they are finite in number. Britain said it supplied 4,000 NLAWs, the next generation light anti-tank weapon, which will be depleted very, very quickly. So it's these stories of counterattacks are good, but we should just caution that it's having an effect. We're by nowhere near the end of this thing yet.
And before we ask the final question about what people should look for in the days ahead, I want to just ask you quickly. There's been quite a few stories now that the US thinks that Putin is considering a chemical or a biological strike. There were suggestions today that it would be chlorine gas. Could you talk a little bit about what that means? How does chlorine gas actually work? And do we have any clearer sense of how the West would react?
Well, chlorine is an industrial chemical. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of tons of industrially produced chlorine in Ukraine for perfectly legitimate purposes. This is one of the reasons why Russia has used chlorine gas, and we've seen it before in Syria and thought to be elsewhere in Chechnya, but certainly in Syria, because it's deniable. It has civilian applications, so they can say, it wasn't us. It was either them or somebody destroyed an industrial factory or what have you. But chlorine gas is it can be very well. It can be deadly. Clearly, they use it because it's firstly deniable. Secondly, it's heavier than air, so it will sink down into basements and into low-lying areas. And of course, what's in the basements? Well, that's where civilians are hiding. So it's a horrific weapon to use. It is reasonably easy to defend against. It can burn, so you need to get it off your skin and get rid of any clothing that's contaminated with it. But largely, it doesn't get into the body through the skin. It has to be inhaled. So covering the nose and mouth with a rag. And I'm sorry, it's so close to breakfast, but a urine-soaked rag is shown to be very, very effective at repelling chlorine. So there are certain things that civilians can do. Military people should be well protected against this with their respirators and their generally better clothing. But there are things that civilians can do. But of course they don't They don't really know it's happening. I mean, until you start seeing this stuff, and generally after a strike, there's dust and smoke and God knows what else. So you don't really know until you're suffering the effects of chlorine gas that you're under attack. So they are brutal weapons, and like I say, deniable. But whether the West would be so bold as to say that it's a red line, I think it's notable that they haven't yet. Obama made the big mistake in Syria, saying that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line, and then they used chemical weapons, and he did nothing about it. And that lesson was taken on board by Assad and Russia. So the West now have been very very cautious about ascribing any cost to these things. So Western officials said in a brief last night that we shouldn't see the war at the moment of being guns and bullets and bombs and artillery and air power. Oh, and then there's a line and we go into chemical and biological. It's a continuum, and we have escalated, or there has been escalation throughout this war so far into what we see now. And look at the devastation in Mariupol, and look at civilian areas being bombarded. I mean, that is not normal warfare. These are war crimes. So we shouldn't see that there's going to be some massive defining moment after which chemical weapons are used. They could very easily be used now. And equally, the West do not want to box themselves into a corner by saying, unless you do this, or we're only going to act if you do that. If you use chemical weapons, that's when we'll really pull out the big guns. So they're not going to do that because that would then make them a hostage to fortune, as they were in Syria in 2012. But also they want to make the point that doesn't mean we shouldn't accept it as normal. What's happening at the moment, this is horrendous, and it's a massive escalation. And so we shouldn't just accept that what we've got at the moment is the best of it.
And for all of our listeners, what should we be looking out for in the next few days across Ukraine?
Well, it shouldn't be any news that the Russian advance has completely stalled. And I'm very nervous about President Biden's talk of chemical weapons, because the intelligence communities have generally been pretty much on the ball on this. They've called it. They called the invasion, and they got most of the intelligence right. And what they've done is they've worked out a way of getting very sensitive information into the public domain in order to kind of wrest the initiative from Russia. So we've seen some very sensitive information in the press. We the press are briefed regularly by Western officials. There's the vernacular that we are asked to use, and you should take it from trusted sources. Take your news from trusted sources. Check everything. Mistakes will be made, but please do check everything and go to those trusted sources rather than just the Twitterati. But they've called it right so far. So Biden's use of this language makes me wonder if they've seen something that they've not yet told us and is not yet in the open forum, that there might be an attack coming up. Now, it's Biden speaking in interview. This wasn't a briefing from the US intelligence community or any Western defense community. But for him to actually raise it, I'm very, very nervous. The attack's not going well. Putin is increasingly isolated. Sanctions are beginning to bite. Sanctions are big and small. The disgruntlement from young people in Russian society because they've lost Instagram and McDonald's and all the rest of it, which we shouldn't make light of. I mean, this is part and parcel of what we consider normal. So they've lost that. They are unhappy. Putin knows this, and Biden said his back's against the wall, and that's not a good place to put a person with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Dom. Earlier this week, you may have seen the upsetting and extraordinary photos in the Telegraph from the Children's Hospital in Zaporizhia in Ukraine. The photographer there was Simon Townsley. My colleague, Sophie Coe, managed to grab a few minutes with him to talk about what it's like capturing images of conflict. And just a warning to listeners, parts of this conversation describe scenes of injury that some might find distressing.
Can you describe to us where you are right now and what your days are looking like at the moment?
Sure. Well, at the moment, we are based in Dnipro, which is over towards the east of Ukraine, about 500 miles from Lviv. It's quite a good location to be in. It allows us to move down further south towards Mariupol without getting caught up in anything that goes on down there. So that is an area of concern at the moment. If we're lucky, we start the day with breakfast. So because there's a curfew here, the staff can't get into the hotel early enough to start breakfast before 8:30, and that does not always work for us. So sometimes we have to start before breakfast, in which case we hit the road and we generally stop at the first place that we can find fuel to top the tank up. You have to keep the tanks topped up because there are regional shortages of fuel. And that gives us an opportunity to buy some snacks for the car, then drive to wherever we think the story is for that day. And we've usually determined that the night before. So we live pretty much from day to day as to where we're going to locate ourselves. Sometimes, from hour to hour, reacting to whatever goes on. And the distances in this country are phenomenal. So to give you an example, when we do finally pull out of this area, it's going to take us about 36 hours to get out to Warsaw because we have to drive the whole way and the roads are so congested with refugees fleeing that you can be caught up in tailbacks for hours and hours and hours, going through checkpoints. So there are a lot of checkpoints you have to contend with. And sometimes they're friendly and sometimes they're aggressive and sometimes they keep you for a while and go through the car. And sometimes they ask you whether you've got weapons, and occasionally they offer us sweets. It's really unpredictable. I mean, everything about photographing in these situations is entirely unpredictable.
Yeah, I mean, you're taking risks at every turn. Keeping that risk in mind, I guess, what do you see as the role of a photojournalist during times of war?
Well, I think the role of the photographer is to identify and then capture images that give you a sense of the reality of what's going on. That can happen in a couple of ways. It can either happen because there happens to be an immediacy about a situation that you come across, perhaps somewhere that's just been attacked, and you go in there and you record everything you see around you. The other way is that you might say, well, we need to look at what is happening with refugees here. Why don't we tell that story by visiting the children's intensive care unit and seeing the children who have perhaps been evacuated from, well, in this case, we're looking at Mariupol. So we've done that, and then telling the stories and recording what we see in those situations with those kids and their relatives. And so you're either giving immediacy or depth.
Totally. And going back to the hospital you mentioned that you visited the other day, can you give us a sense of what it was like, firstly, in that hospital and the more details about the people that you met there?
We'd made some phone calls the night before. Some of the hospitals are reluctant to take you in and others are very welcoming, and these people were very welcoming. And they want to show the horror of the war and what is happening to these kids who they are looking after. And we arrived early, and there was a French television crew there already. And we said, you go first. While they went, we spoke to the grandmother of one of the children who was very severely injured. I mean, she had lost her leg, and her shoulder was shattered, and she was deaf profoundly from the blast. We were fortunate, really, in that because we let the French TV crew go in first, it gave us much more of an opportunity to get into the story in more depth. And so we spoke to this woman who was just beyond despairing of her beautiful 15-year-old granddaughter who had been mutilated purely because she was in the wrong place. And there was no reason for that to happen. So she became more and more emotional and more upset as we spoke to her in the corridor. And she was very comfortable with me photographing her. And I was less comfortable photographing her than she was being photographed. And then while we were talking to her, I glanced over the shoulder of one of the doctors, and there was a boy and a woman sitting down, and the woman was holding the boy's hand. So I photographed them, and I found out that that is the 15-year-old Masha's boyfriend, Alexei, being comforted by one of the psychologists at the hospital, who's kind of helping to support the family and to support him. That was the way into the story for us. So it was already very emotional. And then the French crew left, and the doctor said, well, come with me. And so we were led into a room with 3 beds in it, and each bed had a child in. And I immediately started photographing each child in turn. It was very distressing because they were very distressed. I mean, the first girl I photographed, Melina, was very distressed. She was ventilated because she'd been severely injured. She'd been shot in the face, and consequently, I think it had damaged her windpipe, and so she had been ventilated. But the sedation was wearing off, and so she was kind of coming into consciousness, which was very difficult to watch. And she opened her eyes, and that was an awful thing to see. People who are ventilated are supposed to be kept pretty unconscious. You really don't want to be conscious for that. And then I went to see Masha, who was in the bed diagonally opposite, and I tried to talk to Masha, but she was quite heavily sedated as well, although she did communicate with me, and she let me photograph her. And we had so in order to photograph Masha, we had to ask Masha if we could pull the sheet back gently to one side and see her injury, which is why we were there. And so she let us do that. And then I said, could I see your hand as well? And even though it really hurt her, she rearranged her hand so the sheet was beneath her hand. I don't know if this makes any sense. And I guess you have to see the image to see what I've done. But it was very important to see as much of the person, the girl that she was, not just some lump underneath a sheet, but to see the details of this child's 15-year-old's now broken body. I asked her to look at me, and she did. And then we'd been asked whether we wanted to come in and visit a boy who was very distressed. And I said yes, we would visit him, but we wouldn't be asking any questions around him. But in the end, his father said he was too distressed for that, so we said that's fine. And that is because he had seen his mother burned to death in the car, which was hit by shelling as they escaped. So, that is something I would have photographed, and I'm really pleased I didn't have to.
Yeah, completely. And I know that the piece that went alongside these amazing, heartbreaking photos included the line that the Russians are saying that these kind of photos of injured children are fake. How does it make you feel hearing them say such things?
Yeah, so Ben Farmer was interviewing one of the doctors there while I was photographing, and I could hear this while I was taking pictures of Masha and Melina in particular, and I was thinking, how would you fake this? I mean, how maybe you could, with an adult, put makeup on them and take it, but I mean, how could you fake this kind of level of destruction? I mean, how could you, it's just breathtaking. And it just goes to show how important it is to get your news from a reliable news source and not social media, because I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And the doctor that we interviewed said, look, I share these images with my family in Russia, and they say these images are from a different conflict. So, if people don't want to believe it, they simply won't believe it. And, if it's an inconvenient truth, then they'll just call it a lie. So I was very angry when I heard it while I was taking pictures of a girl struggling to breathe. It just, yeah, well, let me tell you, it's all real. And I'm very happy to meet anybody and show them what I shot and, go through it all.
And you've spoken also to a lot of refugees who are fleeing and who are leaving Ukraine. Can you tell us more about what they're saying to you and the emotions that are going through their brains, I guess?
We've just come back. I got back about 20 minutes ago and filed some more photographs of refugees who have fled Mariupol, and we drove down to meet some more people, and everybody's story is different, and everybody's story is shocking, equally shocking. And I've spent days talking to refugees and days photographing them, and I keep thinking, well, I must have heard it all now. I mean, I can't be shocked again. And I'm always shocked, and I'm always distressed at the tiniest little things, we've serialized Olga's diaries, and Olga showed me some video of them going into their apartment, which had been pretty heavily hit, and walking around the apartment videoing all their beautiful little things that meant something to them, just showered in glass. The children's toys sort of covered in debris, and all their special things ripped off the walls, and an entirely unlivable house. And then, the next day it just burnt down because it was shelled again, and the entire apartment block caught fire. And so they left with nothing. But these tiny little parts of, she said, we were in there for 3 weeks under siege. And one day I went out to give my daughter a little bit of exercise, and we went to the playground, and she fell off the swing and cut her head open. And the struggle that they had, I mean, normally if your child falls over and cuts themselves, you just bathe their wounds and you cuddle them up and put them in front of TV and give them a hot drink. And she couldn't do any of those things. She didn't have any clean water to wash. There was nothing hot to heat up. So every tiny little part of your life as you know it changes. When I talk to people and I photograph them, and at the end of spending time with them, I want to say, and I have to stop myself saying, everything's going to be okay, everything will work out. Because I don't know that. I don't know what's going to happen. And I'd like to be able to say something reassuring or encouraging, but I'm slightly at a loss. So anyway, that was quite a long answer.
No, it was completely fascinating and equally heartbreaking. And the people, away from refugees, you must have spoken to people as well that are staying. What reasons do they give you for staying, whether they actually can, or I'm sure some of them can't leave? But what do they say to you about that?
Well, some want to stay because their husbands have to stay and the men can't leave. Some want to stay because they've got elderly relatives and they just can't transport them. Some need to stay because of relationships with sick relatives who they have to look after. There's one woman who was really torn because her husband's got to stay, but her son is 17, and when he turns 18, he'll have to stay. So does she stay with her husband here, or does she get out while she's still allowed to get her son out? And, to complicate it, their daughter needs particular treatment for an issue she's got with her kidneys. And so they're really worried about being able to kind of deal with that on the journey, and will they get the medication that they need? So maybe they won't, in which case they shouldn't leave because they can get access to it here. So, every single life has got these massive contradictions and problems for most people.
Yeah, it's the same kind of issues of logistics, which you think wouldn't come into such a tragedy, but actually do as people kind of navigate their daily lives. My next question moves more towards your situation. What are the biggest challenges for you as a photojournalist? You've mentioned the difficulty of parting with people and trying to offer some sort of consolation. Is that the hardest thing, or is it physically the risks that you're putting yourself under?
I'm not sure the risks are really a factor here for me. At the moment, I think the situation is broadly fairly stable unless you're right up in the front line. You would be very unlucky to get injured. Look, travelling around is dangerous because, there are desperate people, columns of vehicles, travelling very fast. Suddenly they encounter a roadblock. Somebody will pull out into your lane coming your way and, and they're travelling, they're not taking care. So there are a lot of road accidents. So road safety is a challenge. I mentioned fuel. That's a problem. Accommodation is very difficult. If you're travelling through the country and you need to stop because you're not going to make it through in time for the curfew, you can find yourself, there's no accommodation. The hotels are full of people, refugees moving on the move. And so you can end up having to sleep in the car. And it's been really cold too. So you don't really want to be sleeping in the car when it's -7 degrees, and it can all change pretty quickly. We have experienced that before.
And looking ahead, is there a point where it gets too much for even photojournalists, or is this the kind of thing that you will? Do you see yourself staying?
So this is getting heavily into my 4th week here, and we'll rotate out, I think, at the end of this week. And I expect I'll be coming back regularly. Everybody has their own threshold, and and it changes depending on how tired you are, who you're traveling with, what your personal circumstances are. You have to just make a call on what you're prepared to do and what the story is and what the value of the story is. So at the moment, we've done okay, and I'll keep doing it.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you found this show helpful, follow Ukraine, the latest on your podcast app. And if there's something we could do to make it even more useful, do let us know. You can email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine, the latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And on Twitter, Sophie Coe.